Elfleda Sterling checked his platinum Patek Philippe, a smug, satisfied smile playing on his lips. It had been exactly 6 months since the divorce, the precise time frame he had calculated it would take for his ex-wife to burn through her meager settlement and come crawling back to his Tribeca penthouse. Tonight was the apex of the New York social season, the Robin Hood Foundation benefit. He fully expected to find Emma waiting outside in the autumn rain, desperate and begging for a second chance. Instead, a shockwave of camera flashes erupted down the red carpet, and Elfleda's crystal champagne flute slipped entirely from his fingers, shattering on the marble. She hadn't come to beg. She had arrived in a breathtaking custom Dior gown, her hand resting casually on the arm of Nathaniel Roth, the most ruthless, elusive billionaire on Wall Street. The boardroom at Sullivan and Cromwell was a monument to intimidation. Located on the 32nd floor overlooking the grey, churning waters of the East River, it was a room designed to make people feel small. Emma sat perfectly still in the oversized leather chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Across the mahogany expanse sat Elfleda, looking every inch the tech titan he had become, flanked by 3 aggressively tailored divorce attorneys. "Sign the papers, Emma," Elfleda said, his voice laced with the heavy, paternalistic sigh he always used when he thought she was being slow. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were glued to the screen of his phone, likely reading a message from Chloe. Chloe DuPont, his 24-year-old head of public relations, who had somehow managed to do a lot of her PR work in Elfleda's private hotel suites in Paris and Aspen. Emma looked down at the document, the prenuptial agreement she had signed at 22, back when Elfleda was just a struggling software developer operating out of a cramped garage in Queens, was ironclad. She had loved him then. She had spent countless nights writing the foundational code for what would eventually become Sterling Core, his flagship enterprise software. She had smiled through the panic attacks, cooked cheap ramen to stretch their budget, and acted as his sounding board, his therapist, and his ghostwriter. But when the company hit its first billion-dollar valuation, Elfleda's memory of who built the foundation had conveniently vanished. He became a fixture on financial magazine covers, and Emma became an embarrassing relic of his humble beginnings. She was too quiet, too observant, and didn't wear enough designer labels to fit into his new reality. $500,000, Emma said quietly, her voice barely breaking the suffocating silence of the room. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Sterling Innovations was currently valued at $4.2 billion. Elfleda finally looked up, his handsome face twisting into a mask of condescending pity. "It's more than generous, Emma. You have to understand, I built this empire. You were supportive, and I appreciate that. But let's not pretend you have the acumen to survive in my world. Take the money. Buy a nice little condo in New Jersey. Start over." Beside him, his lead attorney, a shark-eyed man named Harrison, pushed a Mont Blanc pen across the table. "Mr. Sterling is extending a courtesy, Mrs. Sterling. If we take this to court, we will enforce the prenup to the letter, and you will walk away with nothing but the clothes on your back." Emma didn't cry. The tears had dried up months ago, on the night she found a diamond tennis bracelet in Elfleda's coat pocket, and naively thought it was for their 5th anniversary, only to see it sparkling on Chloe's wrist on a red carpet 2 days later. She picked up the heavy pen. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. She simply signed her name in 3 places, Emma Davis. She was taking her maiden name back. As she stood up to leave, Elfleda leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "I give it 6 months, he said, loud enough for the lawyers to hear. "You've been living in a bubble of my money for half a decade. When you realize how cold the real world is, when you realize you're a 30-year-old woman with a blank resume, my door is always open. But you'll be coming back as an employee, not a wife." Emma paused at the heavy glass door. She turned her head slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his. "Enjoy the company, Sir Elfleda. I hope the code holds up without me." Elfleda scoffed, rolling his eyes as he returned to his phone. Emma walked out into the crisp New York afternoon. She didn't hail a black car. She took the subway back to the small, sparsely furnished apartment in Brooklyn she had rented 2 weeks prior. That night, Elfleda took Chloe to Perse to celebrate his newfound freedom, racking up a $4,000 bill. He kept his phone on the table, expecting a barrage of angry, tearful texts from Emma. He expected her to beg for a little more money, to ask how to set up the Wi-Fi, to crumble without his guidance. But the screen remained completely, deafeningly black. For the first 3 months, Elfleda Sterling reveled in his victory. He plastered his new relationship all over social media. Chloe was everything Emma wasn't: loud, flashy, and constantly performing for an audience. They vacationed in St. Bart's. They were photographed at the Monaco Grand Prix. Yet, beneath the champagne-soaked veneer, a tiny, irritating splinter of paranoia began to fester in Elfleda's mind. Emma was entirely off the grid. She hadn't posted a single thing on Instagram. Mutual friends reported that her number was disconnected. Private investigators he casually hired to keep an eye on his investment reported that she rarely left her Brooklyn apartment, save for quiet walks in Prospect Park and occasional trips to a local coffee shop. "She's broken," Elfleda told Chloe one evening as they lounged in the penthouse. "She's probably sitting in the dark, crying over old wedding albums. She has no idea how to hustle." Elfleda was spectacularly wrong. Emma wasn't crying. She was coding, and she was reading the financial pages with the precision of a hawk. While Elfleda was busy playing the visionary playboy, he was ignoring the glaring structural flaws in his newest software update, Sterling Core 2.0. He had fired the senior developers who tried to warn him, surrounding himself instead with sycophants who praised his every move. Emma knew the original code backward and forward, because she had written it. She knew exactly where the vulnerabilities lay. In her 3rd month of freedom, Emma attended an exclusive, invitation-only cybersecurity symposium in Chicago under her maiden name. She didn't wear a flashy dress. She wore a sharp, tailored black suit that cost a fraction of Chloe's wardrobe, but fit her like armor. It was at the hotel bar at the Ritz-Carlton, nursing a neat bourbon, that the trajectory of her life shattered Elfleda's intended narrative. "You're the ghost in the machine," a deep, resonant voice said from the stool beside her. Emma turned to see Nathaniel Roth. He was a myth in the financial district, a self-made billionaire who ran Roth Capital, a fiercely private hedge fund known for ruthlessly shorting overvalued tech companies. Nathaniel was 38, with sharp, aristocratic features, striking silver at his temples, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "Excuse me," Emma asked, setting her glass down. "Sterling Innovations," Nathaniel said, signaling the bartender for a refill. "I've had a team of MIT grads tearing apart their back-end architecture for a month. It's a mess. But the legacy code, the foundational architecture, is brilliant. It's elegant, and it absolutely does not match the sloppy patches Elfleda Sterling has been pushing for the last 2 years. Someone else built the foundation. Someone smarter than him." He turned his piercing gaze to her. "Someone named Emma Davis." Emma's heart pounded, but her face remained a mask of cool indifference. "And if I am?" "If you are," Nathaniel leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur, "then you know Sterling Core 2.0 is going to collapse under its own weight when they try to integrate it with the Department of Defense contract next month. I am preparing to short Sterling Innovations to the ground. But I need absolute certainty. I need the ghost." Emma looked at the billionaire. This wasn't a man looking for a pretty accessory. This was a predator inviting her on a hunt. "I don't work for free, Mr. Roth," Emma said evenly. Nathaniel smiled. It was a dangerous, thrilling smile. "I wouldn't insult you by asking. I'll give you a 5% cut of the total profits if your analysis is correct. And Emma, I stand to make $2 billion off Elfleda's arrogance. Over the next 3 months, Emma didn't just work with Nathaniel. She became his intellectual equal. They spent late nights in the war room of Roth Capital, eating cold Thai food, mapping out the impending failure of Elfleda's empire. Where Elfleda had constantly belittled her ideas, Nathaniel demanded them. He challenged her, respected her, and slowly, intensely, fell in love with her brilliant mind. The business partnership crackled with an unspoken, heavy tension. One rainy night in his private study, as Emma pointed out the final fatal flaw in Elfleda's security matrix, Nathaniel caught her hand. He didn't say a word, but the way he looked at her, as if she were the most valuable, exquisite thing he had ever encountered, rewrote every insecurity Elfleda had ever beaten into her. Emma Davis was no longer a victim waiting in the wings. She was the architect of her ex-husband's downfall. 6 months to the day after the divorce was finalized, the Robin Hood Foundation benefit descended upon the Javits Center. It was the undisputed heavyweight champion of New York charity events, an invitation-only gala where billionaires, politicians, and celebrities gathered to flex their wealth and status. Elfleda Sterling was a platinum sponsor. He arrived in a chauffeured Maybach, practically strutting onto the red carpet. Chloe was on his arm, draped in a garish, sequined Versace gown that left little to the imagination, heavy Cartier diamonds suffocating her neck. "Smile for the cameras, baby," Elfleda murmured, soaking in the flashbulbs. He felt invincible. Sterling Innovations' stock was at an all-time high, completely oblivious to the massive short positions secretly building up against it in the dark pools of Wall Street. Inside the vast, opulent hall, Elfleda held court. He clinked glasses with venture capitalists and senators, loudly bragging about his impending government contracts. "Hey, Elfleda," slurred Bradley, a fellow tech CEO, leaning in closely. "Whatever happened to Emma? Man, she was quiet, but she kept your books tight. Haven't seen her in ages." Elfleda smirked, taking a sip of his Dom Perignon. "Emma is learning a harsh lesson in reality, Brad. She's probably temping somewhere in Midtown. I told her the door is open when she gets desperate enough. But you know how pride is. Give her another month. She'll be begging for a job." Across town, in the sprawling, multi-level penthouse of the Pierre Hotel overlooking Central Park, the woman they were discussing was undergoing a transformation. Emma stood before a full-length antique mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back. The mousy, invisible wife was dead. In her place stood a queen. She wore a custom, midnight blue Dior gown that cascaded over her curves like liquid night, structured and powerful. Her hair, previously kept in a simple, practical cut, was swept into an elegant, intricate style. Nathaniel stepped into the room, adjusting the cuffs of his Tom Ford tuxedo. He stopped dead in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. "You look," Nathaniel started, then shook his head, a rare, genuine smile breaking across his features. "Lethal. You look absolutely lethal, Emma." "Good," Emma said, turning to face him. She reached over and adjusted his bow tie slightly, a gesture of comfortable intimacy that made Nathaniel's eyes darken. "Because tonight is the night. The DoD stress test on his servers happens at midnight," Nathaniel confirmed, his voice dropping to a gravelly hum. "My analysts are ready. By 9 a.m. tomorrow, the market will know his software is compromised. The stock will plummet. But tonight is just for you." Nathaniel offered his arm, ready to show him what he threw away. "He didn't throw me away, Nate," Emma corrected softly, slipping her arm through his. "He just didn't realize he was holding a grenade until I pulled the pin." Back at the gala, the energy in the room suddenly shifted. The low hum of 1,000 simultaneous conversations seemed to halt. The heavy velvet curtains at the grand entrance parted, and a hush fell over the crowd, rippling outward like a stone dropped in a pond. Elfleda, mid-laugh at a terrible joke, turned towards the entrance, annoyed by the interruption. He expected a movie star. He expected a politician. The flashbulbs from the press corral went into an absolute frenzy, a blinding, strobing white light. And then Elfleda saw her. Emma. She wasn't hiding in the corner. She wasn't wearing an apologetic smile. She commanded the room with every step she took down the grand staircase, the midnight blue silk trailing behind her. But it wasn't just her stunning transformation that caused Elfleda's jaw to unhinge and his champagne flute to slip from his suddenly numb fingers, crashing onto the marble floor. It was the man holding her hand, Nathaniel Roth, a man who refused all interviews, shunned all social events, and had enough liquid capital to buy Elfleda's company 3 times over. Nathaniel Roth, looking at Elfleda's discarded, worthless ex-wife as if she were a goddess he had sworn to worship. Chloe tugged frantically at Elfleda's arm. Babe, what's wrong? Who is that?" Elfleda couldn't speak. He couldn't breathe. He watched, paralyzed, as Emma glided through the sea of elite billionaires. The power brokers who usually ignored Elfleda were scrambling to part the waters for Nathaniel Roth, and as Emma walked past Elfleda's table, she didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She looked him dead in the eye, and she offered him a cool, devastatingly empty smile, a smile that said, without a single word, "Checkmate." The air in the Robin Hood Gala had grown thick, the usual hum of polite, high-society networking replaced by the electric crackle of gossip. Everywhere Elfleda looked, he saw heads leaning together, eyes darting between him and the VIP booth, where Emma and Nathaniel Roth sat in quiet, powerful isolation. Elfleda's face was flushed, a mixture of expensive champagne and sudden, violently unexpected humiliation. Chloe tugged at his sleeve again, her voice a shrill whisper. "Elfleda, people are staring. Do you know that guy? Bradley said he's worth 20 billion. "Shut up, Chloe," Elfleda hissed, immediately regretting it when her face crumpled. He took a deep breath, smoothing the lapels of his Tom Ford jacket. His ego, inflated by years of sycophantic praise, refused to accept the reality of the room. In his mind, Emma was still the timid coda he had discarded. Nathaniel Roth was just a man who had picked up a shiny, temporary toy. "I'm going to say hello," Elfleda declared, his voice tight. He grabbed 2 fresh glasses of champagne from a passing waiter and marched across the ballroom. As he approached, the invisible force field around Nathaniel Roth became palpable. 2 broad-shouldered men in understated suits shifted slightly, forming a subtle barrier. Nathaniel didn't look up from his conversation with Emma, but he raised a single finger. The guards paused, allowing Elfleda to step to the edge of the table. "Emma," Elfleda said loudly, adopting the patronizing, booming voice he used in boardrooms. "I have to admit, I didn't expect to see you here, and certainly not playing dress-up." Emma finally turned to look at him. Up close, the transformation was even more staggering. Her eyes, once filled with anxious devotion, were dark, calm, and terrifyingly clear. "Hello, Elfleda. The dress isn't play. It's custom Dior." Nathaniel Roth slowly leaned back against the plush velvet banquette, swirling the amber liquid in his rocks glass. He looked at Elfleda not with anger, but with the cold, detached curiosity of a biologist examining an insect. "You must be Elfleda Sterling," Nathaniel said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that commanded immediate silence from the adjacent tables. "I've been spending a lot of time reviewing your work." Elfleda puffed out his chest. "Sterling Innovations is changing the landscape of global infrastructure. I'm sure a hedge fund manager like yourself would find our quarterlies impressive, Mr. Roth, though I must warn you my ex-wife's knowledge of the company is strictly legacy. She hasn't been involved since we scaled to the enterprise level." Nathaniel smiled. It was a terrifying expression. "I am well aware of what she knows, Elfleda. And I am well aware of what happens when you attempt to scale a fragile architecture built on stolen genius." Nathaniel checked his Patek Philippe, a vintage, understated piece that made Elfleda's platinum watch look gaudy. "In fact, I believe your enterprise-level scaling is currently being stress-tested by the Department of Defense. It is exactly, Nathaniel paused, letting the silence stretch. 11:59. Elfleda frowned, a cold sweat pricking his hairline. The DoD test is routine. My engineers have it under control. Do they? Emma asked softly. She leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. Did they finally figure out the memory leak in the asynchronous processing module, Elfleda? The one I warned you about 2 years ago. Because if they didn't, the moment the Pentagon hits your servers with a Tier 4 simulated DDoS attack, the entire database will invert. The clock on the wall of the Javits Center struck midnight. For 3 excruciating seconds, nothing happened. Elfleda forced a condescending laugh. Still peddling ghost stories, Emma? You always were too cautious for the big leagues. His phone vibrated. A harsh, sustained buzz against his ribs. Then Bradley's phone rang. Then a venture capitalist at the next table. Suddenly the entire perimeter of the Gala, heavily populated by tech investors and finance executives, erupted in a chorus of frantic ringtones and pinging notifications. Elfleda pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was lit up with 20 missed calls from his chief technology officer. Before he could swipe to unlock it, a text message pushed through. CTO, catastrophic failure. DoD test breached core. Servers melting. We are locked out of our own mainframe. Call me now. Elfleda's face drained of color. He looked from the glowing screen to Emma. She was still watching him, completely unbothered, her expression serene. What did you do? Elfleda whispered, his voice trembling. I did nothing, Elfleda, Emma replied, her voice smooth as glass. I just stopped fixing your mistakes. Nathaniel stood up, effortlessly buttoning his jacket. He placed a possessive, gentle hand on the small of Emma's back. It's getting a bit desperate in here, darling. Shall we? Elfleda stood paralyzed, his phone vibrating relentlessly in his hand, as the architect of his empire and the orchestrator of his ruin walked out of the ballroom, leaving him to face the flames alone. The opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange the following morning didn't ring. It tolled. By 9:30 a.m., the financial news networks were in a state of absolute hysteria. On CNBC, the chyron running across the bottom of the screen read in bold red letters, Sterling Innovations, STRL, halted amidst DoD security catastrophe. Elfleda Sterling sat in his glass-walled corner office, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot. The remnants of a shattered crystal tumbler lay in the corner of the room. Outside his door, the headquarters was a war zone. Engineers were running down the halls, phones were ringing off the hook, and the public relations team, led by a terrified, out-of-her-depth Chloe, was hiding in a conference room. Harrison, the shark-eyed lead attorney, burst into the office without knocking. He looked physically ill. We are bleeding out, Elfleda, Harrison barked, slamming a tablet onto the mahogany desk. The Pentagon didn't just fail us. They publicly blacklisted us. They cited a fundamental architectural flaw that compromises national security. The stock opened down 45%. It's currently hovering at $12 a share. Yesterday, it was at 80. Fix it, Elfleda screamed, slamming his fists on the desk. Get the engineers to patch the damn module. Tell PR to draft a statement about a minor, localized outage. There is no patch, Elfleda, Harrison yelled back. Your CTO just resigned. He told Bloomberg that the foundational code was sound, but the 2.0 overlays you insisted on rushing to market created a backdoor that a high schooler could hack. We are facing federal negligence lawsuits. Elfleda collapsed into his chair, pulling at his hair. Who is shorting us? Someone is driving this panic. Find out who is dumping the stock. Harrison's face tightened. We already know. SEC filings just went public. Roth Capital initiated a massive short position 3 months ago. They leveraged every contact they had. Nathaniel Roth stands to make roughly $2.4 billion by the time the bell rings today. Elfleda felt his stomach drop into a bottomless abyss. The image of Nathaniel and Emma at the Gala flashed in his mind. The mocking smile, the custom Dior. I stand to make $2 billion off Elfleda's arrogance. But that's not even the worst part, Harrison continued, his voice dropping to a grim monotone. The DoD just announced they've awarded an emergency contract to a private cybersecurity firm to rebuild their compromised infrastructure, a firm that apparently had a flawless, impenetrable architecture ready to deploy this morning. Elfleda looked up, a cold dread washing over him. What firm? A startup called Aegis Systems, Harrison said. He tapped the tablet, bringing up a press release, funded entirely by Roth Capital. Elfleda stared at the screen. At the top of the press release, in crisp, undeniable font, was the name of the founder and CEO of Aegis Systems, Emma Davis. She hadn't just predicted his downfall. She had actively built the lifeboat that his biggest clients would use to escape his sinking ship, while Elfleda had spent the last 6 months buying supercars and parading Chloe around Monaco. Emma had been writing the most advanced security architecture on the planet, funded by a man who actually recognized her genius. The door to the office cracked open. Chloe stood there, her designer makeup smudged, holding her expensive Hermès Birkin bag tightly against her chest. Elfleda, she said softly, the board is convening an emergency meeting in 10 minutes, and, my agent called. I think I need to step back from the PR role. It's getting a little toxic for my brand. Elfleda stared at the 24-year-old girl he had traded his brilliant wife for. She wasn't staying to fight. She was already calculating her exit strategy. Get out, Elfleda whispered. Elfleda, I just think... Get out, he roared, hurling a heavy crystal paperweight at the doorframe. Chloe shrieked and sprinted down the hallway. Elfleda turned back to the panoramic window overlooking Manhattan. The city that had worshipped him yesterday felt entirely indifferent today. He was trapped in a crumbling tower of his own making, and the woman he had told to beg for a job was now the undisputed queen of the board. And the ultimate, agonizing twist. To save Sterling Innovations from total bankruptcy, Elfleda would need to license the Aegis security architecture. He was going to have to beg Emma. The ride to the financial district was the longest 30 minutes of Elfleda Sterling's life. The back of the sleek, black Cadillac Escalade felt less like a luxury conveyance and more like a rolling tomb. Outside the tinted windows, the grey, unrelenting drizzle of a New York morning mirrored the catastrophic bleeding of his personal net worth. Harrison, his lead counsel, sat rigidly on the opposite leather seat, frantically scrolling through a barrage of emails on his encrypted tablet. The man, usually a portrait of shark-like composure, was sweating through his bespoke Brioni shirt. Goldman Sachs just called again, Harrison said, his voice stripped of its usual commanding baritone, reduced to a hollow rasp. They are threatening to initiate the margin call by noon instead of 4 o'clock. Elfleda. If that happens, the cascade effect will trigger defaults on the Tribeca penthouse, the Aspen property, and the corporate jet. We will be effectively insolvent before the markets close. Elfleda rubbed his temples, a vicious, throbbing headache threatening to split his skull. Tell them to hold off. Tell them we are securing a strategic partnership with Aegis Systems today. The Department of Defense contract will be salvaged. Just buy me 4 hours, Harrison. His phone buzzed violently in his palm. It was Thomas Hayes, the fiercely conservative chairman of the Sterling Innovations Board of Directors. Elfleda hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen, before swiping to accept. Elfleda, Hayes barked, not bothering with pleasantries. Bloomberg is running a segment right now, interviewing 2 of our former lead engineers. They are publicly verifying the catastrophic structural flaws in the 2.0 update. The stock is in a free fall. It just broke the $10 support line. We are at $9.40. Thomas, I am pulling up to One World Trade Center right now, Elfleda replied, forcing a tone of authoritative calm he did not feel. I am going to sit down with Emma. I will secure the licensing rights to the Aegis patch. We will integrate it, satisfy the Pentagon, and issue a joint press release by the closing bell." "You don't have a choice, Elfleda," Hayes said coldly. The board convened at dawn. "If you do not walk out of that building with a signed licensing agreement, we have the votes to trigger the morality clause in your executive contract based on the federal negligence investigation. We will terminate you with cause. You won't see a dime of your golden parachute. Get it done, or don't come back to the office." The line went dead. Elfleda stared at the screen, his chest tightening with a suffocating panic. He had spent his entire adult life cultivating an aura of absolute invincibility. He was the visionary. He was the magazine cover boy. He was the man who had discarded a quiet, unassuming wife because she didn't fit the billion-dollar aesthetic. The Escalade pulled up to the towering glass monolith of One World Trade Center. The architectural giant pierced the low-hanging clouds, an intimidating fortress of modern commerce. "Let's go," Elfleda muttered, stepping out into the freezing rain. The Aegis Systems headquarters occupied the top 3 floors of the tower. It was the antithesis of Elfleda's flashy, chaotic workspace. Stepping off the private elevator onto the 82nd floor, Elfleda was struck by the suffocating silence. There were no neon signs, no ping-pong tables, no frantic energy of a startup desperately trying to prove itself. It was a masterpiece of minimalist intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling glass offered a dizzying, unobstructed view of the Manhattan skyline, a silent, psychological reminder of who was currently looking down on whom. A receptionist with an earpiece escorted them into the main boardroom. The table was a single, massive slab of polished black granite, cold and unyielding. Elfleda stood at the window, his tailored suit hanging slightly looser on his frame than it had 48 hours ago. His hands, buried deeply in his pockets, were trembling. He squeezed them into fists, trying to summon the arrogant swagger that had steamrolled countless venture capitalists. The heavy oak doors clicked open. Elfleda turned, bracing himself. Emma walked in. She was not the same woman he had bullied into signing a $500,000 divorce settlement. She wore a pristine, impeccably tailored ivory Alexander McQueen suit that radiated authority. Her posture was flawless. But it was her eyes that terrified Elfleda the most. They were completely devoid of emotion. No anger, no vindictiveness, no lingering affection. Just pure surgical calculation. She was flanked by 2 top-tier corporate litigators from Skadden Arps, men whose hourly billing rates made even Harrison wince. A moment later, Nathaniel Roth entered the room. The billionaire didn't wear a suit. He wore a dark cashmere sweater and trousers, exuding the casual, devastating power of a man who owned the building, the air they were breathing, and the exact minute they were existing in. Nathaniel didn't even look at Elfleda. He took a seat at the far end of the granite table, opened a sleek silver laptop, and began typing. The message was clear and humiliating. You are not a peer. You are a nuisance, and you belong entirely to her. Elfleda. Harrison, Emma said smoothly, taking the seat at the head of the table. She didn't offer a handshake. Please sit. I know your time is incredibly finite this morning. Elfleda slowly lowered himself into a leather chair. His mouth was dry, tasting of stale coffee and fear. Emma, I'm going to bypass the formalities. We both know why I'm here. You orchestrated a brilliant market squeeze. You identified the vulnerability, you built the patch, and you cornered the market. I have to admit, it was a ruthless play. Congratulations. He forced a tight, patronizing smile, slipping back into his familiar cadence. But let's be realistic. Aegis is a brilliant startup, but it's still a startup. You have the software, but I have the global infrastructure. We need each other to stabilize this situation. Let's talk numbers. What is the licensing fee to integrate the Aegis architecture into Sterling Core 2.0? Emma opened a manila folder, her eyes scanning the top document. There is no integration, Elfleda. Sterling Core 2.0 is functionally dead. The DoD has mandated a complete structural replacement, which Aegis will provide directly. You don't have global infrastructure anymore. You have a burning building, and I happen to own the only fire extinguishers." Harrison leaned forward, adopting his most aggressive negotiating posture. "Mrs. Davis, let's not play games. We are prepared to offer a flat fee of $150 million for a perpetual license of the Aegis architecture. It makes you and your backers incredibly wealthy overnight, and it saves both companies from a prolonged, destructive market bleed." Emma finally looked up, locking eyes with her ex-husband. $150 million. That's a fascinating number. "Do you remember when I asked for $500,000 in our divorce settlement? Just enough to buy a small condo and start over?" Elfleda flinched, a flush of heat rising to his cheeks. "Emma, this is business. Keep your personal emotions out of it." "I am entirely devoid of emotion, Elfleda," Emma replied, her voice dropping to a glacial chill that silenced the room. "If I were emotional, I would sit back and let your company burn to ash, just to watch you cry on CNBC. But I am a businesswoman, and as a businesswoman, I recognize a distressed asset when I see one." Elfleda's eyes narrowed. He decided to play his final, desperate card. "You think you have me cornered, but you don't. You built Aegis using proprietary knowledge you gained while working at Sterling Innovations. You violated your non-compete, and you stole our foundational IP. If you don't sign a licensing agreement today, Harrison will file a federal injunction by noon. We will tie Aegis up in litigation for the next decade. The Pentagon won't touch you with a 10-foot pole if your core software is locked in an intellectual property dispute." Harrison puffed his chest out slightly, ready to back up the threat. Emma didn't blink. She turned slightly to the senior Skadden Arps litigator to her right. "Jonathan, would you please clarify the intellectual property landscape for my ex-husband?" Jonathan Pierce, a man known for dismantling Fortune 500 companies before his morning coffee, slid a thick, meticulously bound legal document across the black granite. "Mr. Sterling," Pierce began, his voice dripping with aristocratic boredom, "3 years ago, you directed your legal team to restructure your corporate tax liabilities. During that process, several foundational patents related to the original Sterling architecture were transferred to a holding company to avoid heavy capitalization taxes, a holding company named CD Tech Holdings." Elfleda stared at the lawyer, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. "So what? It's a subsidiary." "It was a subsidiary," Pierce corrected, tapping the document, "until you refused to pay the filing and maintenance fees for the holding company because you deemed it, and I quote an email from your own outbox, useless administrative overhead. When the holding company went into default, the assets were auctioned off by the state of Delaware. They were quietly purchased for pennies on the dollar by an anonymous shell corporation." Emma leaned forward, the ivory blazer contrasting sharply with the dark, predatory gleam in her eyes. "I bought them, Elfleda. With the first installment of the meager alimony, you actually paid me before you cut me off entirely. Aegis Systems doesn't just own the new architecture. We own the bedrock IP of your entire company. You haven't been the owner of your own software for 2 years. You've been an unwitting tenant, and your lease has just expired." Elfleda felt the blood drain entirely from his face. The room spun slightly. He looked at Harrison, silently begging for a legal loophole, an objection, a lifeline. Harrison was staring at the documents, his face ashen. He slowly shook his head. It was an ironclad checkmate. "I am not licensing my software to you," Emma stated, her voice echoing in the silent room. "I am buying you out." She slid another document across the table. Aegis Systems is initiating a hostile takeover of Sterling Innovations. The board of directors has already been briefed by Mr. Pierce. Given that your stock is currently trading at $9 a share, and you are facing imminent federal negligence indictments, they are highly motivated to sell. I am offering $12 a share to the board. Elfleda slammed his fist onto the table, his composure finally, violently snapping. I hold 51% of the voting shares. You can't force a buyout without my signature. I built that company in a garage. I am the visionary. From the end of the table, Nathaniel Roth finally stopped typing. He closed his silver laptop with a sharp snap that sounded like a gunshot. You were a mascot, Elfleda, Nathaniel said, his resonant baritone filling the room. A very expensive, very loud, very incompetent mascot. Emma was the visionary. You were just the marketing budget. Emma raised a hand, keeping the focus on her. You are correct, Elfleda. You hold the controlling shares. Which brings us to the final document. She slid a thinner, single-page contract across the table. This is an irrevocable transfer of your voting rights and your equity to Aegis Systems, Emma explained, her tone conversational as if she were ordering a coffee. In exchange, Aegis will assume all legal liability for the Department of Defense breach. We will deploy our patch under the Aegis banner, shielding you from the impending federal indictments. You walk away with absolutely nothing, but you walk away a free man. You're out of your mind, Elfleda hissed, his breath ragged. I will fight this. I will drain you. With what money? Nathaniel interjected softly, leaning back in his chair. My analysts tracked your portfolio, Elfleda. You leveraged your personal assets against sterling stock to fund your lifestyle. Goldman Sachs isn't just threatening a margin call. I bought your debt from them 30 minutes ago. You owe Roth Capital $90 million, a debt that is due at 4 p.m. today. If you do not sign that paper, I will personally see to it that the bank seizes your penthouse, your cars, and your art. And then, I will hand your files over to the SEC, who are currently drafting subpoenas for criminal fraud. Emma folded her hands on the table. You told me I would be begging for a job in 6 months, Elfleda. It hasn't even been 24 hours since the gala. Look at you. You aren't just begging for a job. You're begging for your freedom. The silence that followed was suffocating. The reality of his absolute, inescapable destruction crushed the breath from Elfleda's lungs. He looked at the single piece of paper. It represented the death of his empire, his identity, and his ego. Harrison quickly reviewed the document. He leaned over, his voice a frantic whisper. Elfleda, sign it. If the SEC drops the hammer, you are looking at 5 to 10 years in Allenwood. She has us dead to rights. Sign the paper. Elfleda looked at Emma one last time. He searched her face for a flicker of pity, a remnant of the girl who used to make him ramen at 2 a.m. in Queens, the girl who had believed in him when no one else did. There was nothing there. She had evolved into an apex predator, and he was nothing more than prey that had wandered too far from the herd. With a shaking, bloodless hand, Elfleda Sterling reached out and picked up the Mont Blanc pen that Pierce offered him. The heavy gold pen felt like an anvil in his grip. He didn't argue. He didn't scream. The fight had been entirely hollowed out of him. He pressed the nib to the paper and signed his name, officially erasing himself from the empire he claimed to have built. Emma pulled the document back, her eyes scanning the signature to ensure it was legally binding. She didn't smile. She just closed the manila folder. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, Emma said, her voice dismissing him from her reality forever. Security will escort you out. Please leave your corporate keycard on the desk. The rain slicing through the neon-lit canyons of Manhattan's Diamond District was freezing, carrying the bitter, metallic bite of a New York November. Elfleda Sterling stood outside a nondescript jewelry exchange on 47th Street, his collar turned up against the relentless wind. He wasn't wearing Tom Ford today. He wore a faded navy pea coat that had survived the asset liquidations only because it had been buried in the back of a guest closet. He pushed through the heavy glass doors, shaking the water from his hair, and walked up to a reinforced glass counter. Behind it sat an older man, with a jeweler's loop permanently wedged into his eye socket. Elfleda reached into his pocket and placed a watch on the scratched velvet mat. It wasn't the platinum Patek Philippe that had been seized by the bankruptcy courts 11 months ago, along with the Tribeca penthouse, the Maybach, and the modern art collection. This was a vintage stainless steel Rolex Daytona. He had hidden it in a gym bag during the federal audits. Papers? Box? The pawnbroker asked, his voice a gravelly monotone, not even looking up. Lost them in a move, Elfleda muttered, glancing nervously at the security cameras. His voice lacked the booming, arrogant resonance that used to command boardrooms. It was thin, hollowed out by a year of relentless, crushing defeat. The pawnbroker scrutinized the piece for agonizing minutes. Crystals scratched. No provenance. I'll give you 4,000. Cash. 4,000? Elfleda choked out, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. That's a $20,000 timepiece. It's an authentic. It's 4,000. Or you can take a walk back into the rain, buddy, the man interrupted, sliding the watch back toward Elfleda. Markets flooded with distressed tech bros trying to make rent. Take it or leave it. Elfleda's jaw tightened. He thought about the eviction notice taped to the door of his cramped fourth-floor walk-up in Astoria, Queens. He thought about the mounting legal bills from his defense attorneys, who were desperately trying to keep him out of a minimum security federal prison in Allenwood after the SEC concluded their investigation into Sterling Innovations' fraudulent defense contracts. He swallowed his pride, a bitter, jagged pill he had been forced to consume daily. Fine, I'll take it. Clutching the envelope of cash, Elfleda descended into the subterranean gloom of the subway station. As he waited for the F train, surrounded by the damp, exhausted faces of commuters, his eyes drifted to a newsstand. He froze. The breath hitched painfully in his chest. Staring back at him from the glossy cover of Forbes magazine was Emma. She was photographed sitting casually on the edge of a massive black marble conference table. She wore a razor-sharp ivory Alexander McQueen suit, her dark hair falling in sleek waves around her shoulders. She looked authoritative, brilliant, and entirely untouchable. Standing just behind her, his hand resting supportively on the back of her chair, was Nathaniel Roth. The headline was printed in bold, uncompromising gold lettering. The ghost in the machine becomes the queen of Silicon Alley. How Emma Davis and Nathaniel Roth built Aegis Systems into a $50 billion fortress. Elfleda bought the magazine with trembling hands, using one of the crisp $100 bills he had just desperately bargained for. He sat on the hard plastic seat of the subway car, oblivious to the screeching wheels, and forced himself to read every agonizing word. The article detailed the astronomical, meteoric rise of Aegis Systems over the past 12 months. Following the hostile takeover of Sterling Innovations, Emma hadn't just patched the Department of Defense servers, she had entirely revolutionized them. She had spent the first quarter ruthlessly dismantling Elfleda's bloated, sloppy architecture. She fired the sycophantic executives Elfleda had championed and reinstated the original, brilliant engineers he had pushed out. But it was the second quarter that cemented her legacy. The article described a legendary, closed-door meeting at the Pentagon with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Emma hadn't sent a proxy. She had walked into the highest security briefing room in the country and flawlessly mapped out a quantum-resistant encryption matrix that rendered foreign cyber espionage functionally obsolete. She didn't just understand the code, a quoted four-star general noted in the piece. She understood the psychology of the breach. She was 10 steps ahead of the world's most sophisticated state-sponsored hackers. She is, without hyperbole, a national asset. By the time the train rattled into his stop in Queens, Elfleda felt physically ill. The article also touched upon the spectacular collapse of his own life. It mentioned the SEC fines that had wiped out his accounts. It mentioned Harrison, his former lead attorney, who had publicly defected to a rival firm, citing irreconcilable ethical differences with Elfleda. And in a tiny, humiliating footnote at the end of page 4, it mentioned Chloe DuPont. True to her nature, Chloe hadn't stayed for the sinking ship. The moment the SEC subpoenas arrived, she had flipped, cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for full immunity. She was currently leveraging her newfound notoriety by starring in a Bravo reality television series titled Fallen Empires, where she tearfully recounted the trauma of dating a disgraced fraudster. Elfleda unlocked the deadbolt to his apartment. It smelled faintly of stale garlic from the restaurant downstairs. He threw his wet coat over a cheap laminate chair and sat on the edge of a mattress that laid directly on the floor. He was exactly where he had started a decade ago, only this time he was stripped of the youthful potential and, more importantly, he was utterly alone. He had thrown away the architect of his success, mistaking her quiet brilliance for insignificance. Miles away from the damp squalor of Queens, the atmosphere was a study in absolute contrast. The trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange was a cacophony of ringing phones, shouting traders, and electronic hums. But as the clock ticked toward 4 p.m., a palpable hush fell over the VIP balcony. Emma Davis stood at the podium, her hand resting over the glowing button that would ring the closing bell. It was the anniversary of Aegis Systems' public offering. In a single year, her company's stock had quintupled, driven by exclusive contracts with JP Morgan Chase, NATO, and the European Central Bank. Nathaniel stood beside her, his presence a quiet, immovable anchor in the storm of flashbulbs and cheering executives. He wasn't looking at the crowd, nor at the massive digital ticker displaying the Aegis stock symbol, Aegis, in bright green. He was looking entirely at Emma. "Ready to close it out, partner?" Nathaniel murmured, his voice cutting through the noise, meant only for her. Emma turned her head, offering him a smile that was warm, genuine, and devoid of the shadows that had once haunted her. "Let's shut it down." She pressed the button. The resonant, iconic chime of the closing bell echoed across the trading floor, followed instantly by a deafening roar of applause from the traders below. Confetti drifted down from the ceiling, catching the bright studio lights. Emma looked down at the sea of faces, people whose livelihoods now depended on the architecture she had built from scratch in a Brooklyn apartment. Later that evening, the noise of the city faded into a muted, distant hum as they boarded a private Bombardier Global 7500 jet at Teterboro Airport. The cabin was a masterpiece of understated luxury: cream leather, polished walnut, and soft ambient lighting. They were en route to Davos, Switzerland, where Emma was scheduled to deliver the keynote address at the World Economic Forum on global data sovereignty. Emma kicked off her heels and curled her legs beneath her on the plush sofa, accepting a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon from the flight attendant. She watched out the porthole window as the glittering, sprawling grid of New York City shrank into a constellation of tiny lights beneath them. Nathaniel unbuttoned his suit jacket and sat beside her, handing her a thick, leather-bound dossier. "The preliminary reports on the London acquisition," Nathaniel said, tapping the cover. "Their board is playing hardball. They want a 30% premium on the share price." Emma didn't open the folder. She took a sip of her champagne, her dark eyes reflecting the cabin lights. "They don't have the leverage for a premium, Nate. Their secondary firewalls are using outdated hash algorithms. If we don't buy them out, they'll suffer a catastrophic data breach within 6 months, and their valuation will plummet to pennies. Let them sweat for a week. They'll take our original offer." Nathaniel leaned back, a low, appreciative chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Ruthless. I love it when you talk technical." "I'm not ruthless," Emma corrected softly, resting her head against his shoulder. "I'm just mathematically precise. I learned the hard way that you can't build a stable structure on a compromised foundation. You have to strip it down to the bedrock and start over." Nathaniel wrapped his arm around her, his fingers gently tracing the line of her arm. "Do you ever think about him?" he asked quietly. He didn't need to use a name. Emma looked back out the window. Down there, somewhere in the vast, sprawling boroughs, was Elfleda, a man who had once been the center of her universe, who had convinced her that she was nothing more than a supporting character in his grand narrative. "No," Emma said. And for the first time in her life, it was the absolute, unvarnished truth. There was no anger left, no lingering resentment, no desire for vengeance. Those emotions required energy, and Elfleda Sterling was no longer worth the expenditure of her processing power. He was just a bug in my early code, Nate. A syntax error I finally learned how to debug. Nathaniel smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. And the new code? Emma looked up at him, the man who had recognized her worth when it was buried under years of emotional debris, the partner who stood shoulder to shoulder with her as they conquered the financial world. "The new code is flawless," Emma whispered. The jet banked smoothly into the night sky, ascending above the heavy cloud cover into the clear, starlit stratosphere. Emma Davis closed her eyes, no longer dreaming of the future, because she was entirely too busy building it. The story of Emma Davis is a stark, modern testament to the fatal flaw of arrogance and the quiet, devastating power of unseen genius. Elfleda Sterling believed that power resided in loud deamations, designer labels, and boardroom intimidation. He made the catastrophic mistake of confusing Emma's quiet support for weakness, failing to realize that the person who builds the foundation is the only one who knows how to bring the entire house down. Emma's evolution from a discarded, underestimated ghostwriter into a tech titan underscores a universal truth. True brilliance does not require a spotlight to exist, but when forced into the dark, it will eventually engineer its own dawn. By aligning with Nathaniel, a man who recognized her intellect as an asset rather than a threat, Emma didn't just reclaim her narrative, she rewrote the entire industry. She didn't beg for her life back, she built a better one from the ashes.